To introduce the third and final part of our ceremony, our keynote address by guest speaker, Professor Omer Bartov. Omer Bartov is the John P. Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. He is the author of Anatomy of Genocide, the Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, along with several other well-respected scholarly works on the Holocaust and genocide, including Germany's War and the Holocaust, Disputed Histories, and Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in present-day Ukraine. He has written for the New Republic, the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, and the New York Times Book Review. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and his book, Anatomy of Genocide, the Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, that he will speak about today, won 4 prestigious awards in the past 2 years. The Ab Imperial Award 2018, the National Jewish Book Awards for 2018, the 9th Annual Zocalo Book Award, and the Ad Vashem International Book Award. It is a pleasure to invite you to address us.
Your Excellencies, dignitaries, ambassadors, representatives of the survivor communities, honored guests. Allow me first to thank the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and especially its director, Tali Nates, as well as the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, for organizing and facilitating this important event. I have to say that it's not easy to give this talk today after everything that we have heard, and that the talk that I'm about to give is not an easy one, and it's not an elevating one, and I wish it were more so. What I would like to tell you a little about today is a book that I recently published. As was mentioned, researching this book took me 20 years, researching and writing it. It took me to 9 countries. It called upon using 9 different languages. It led me to close to 50 archives and to collecting and analyzing personal accounts by at least 300 individuals. And all of this is just the story of a little town in Eastern Europe. I started this research in the early 1990s, and as you will recall, the early 1990s were marked first by the end of the Soviet Union. The entire communist system collapsed, and there were those who told us that the end of history had come, and that now we would live in a better world. Shortly thereafter, 2 genocides took place. One in Bosnia in 1992 and one in Rwanda in 1994. It is true, of course, and especially it should be said here, in South Africa, that this was also the moment of the extraordinary end of apartheid. The genocide in Rwanda was distinguished by the fact that it was the fastest genocide in history. In about 10 weeks, 800,000 people were murdered, mostly by machete and fire. It was also the time at which the Holocaust, for the first time, became recognized as an international event. And we tend to forget that in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, the Holocaust was not considered a major event in World War II or in the history of the 20th century, and it was often relegated only to teaching Jewish history. In the 1980s, it became better known, and in the 1990s, it finally achieved international recognition. But the way we understood the Holocaust at the time, and the way many people understand it even today, is an instance of industrial killing. As we heard today, an instance in which people were deported from different parts of Europe in sealed trains, brought to extermination camps, and murdered quickly thereafter. It was seen as an instance in which there was a compartmentalization of the killing process, where no one in particular was responsible, and there was very little connection between the perpetrators and the victims. So in the 1990s, because of these other genocides that occurred at the time, which were very personal, very intimate genocides, in which neighbors killed neighbors, I asked myself, is it possible that there was another side to the Holocaust, that there was an encounter between the victims and the perpetrators? And if there was, what was the nature of that encounter? A topic that most historians at the time did not write about and did not consider. And so in order to do that, because of the vast extent of the Holocaust across an entire continent, with hundreds of thousands of perpetrators and millions of victims, in a great war that was happening at the same time, in order to try to understand that, I decided to choose one town and to see what happened in that town during the Holocaust. And I chose the town of Buchach, and I suspect that many of you have never heard of it. I knew something about Buchach because I grew up in Israel and I went to high school there. I'm not sure if it is taught now in Israeli high schools, but when I was in high school, which was a while ago, one of the texts, the canonical text we read, was stories by Yosef Shmuel Agnon, who happens to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966. And Agnon came from Buchach and wrote a great deal about Buchach. And so I knew about that town. I knew also that two other important individuals came from Buchach. Two of them, these two you might have heard of. One is Shimon Wiesenthal, known as the Nazi hunter after the war. And the other is Emanuel Ringelblum, who was an historian of Polish-Jewish relations and established the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, thanks to which we actually could write the history of that ghetto. But I had a personal reason for choosing that town too, which was that my mother was born there. She was born in 1924, and in 1935, she, her two brothers, and her parents went to Palestine. And so she was not, in that sense, a survivor of the Holocaust. When I was researching what happened to people in Holocaust, I found an entire set of testimonies by young women who were exactly also born in 1924. And I could imagine what would have happened to my mother had she remained in Buchach. So because of that, I decided to interview my mother and ask her, what was it like growing up in that town? And in 1995, when I was 41 and she was 71, I asked her, tell me about your childhood. And she spoke for 90 minutes straight. I turned on a tape recorder and she spoke. And it turned out that I had never asked her that question. And she'd been waiting for the question to be asked. I won't tell you everything that she told me during that conversation, and I'll say only one thing, that what I understood from her memories of that town was that she had fond memories of growing up there. It was a good childhood, but moreover, that it was a multilingual, multi-ethnic childhood. At home, she spoke Yiddish. In school, she spoke Polish because the public school was Polish. And on the street, she spoke Ukrainian because most of her girlfriends were Ukrainian, and they would go to the forest and pick wild berries and mushrooms. Now, she, of course, left in 1935. But because of this story, it occurred to me that the initial question that I had, which was about the encounter between the victims and the perpetrators, was insufficient. Because when the perpetrators came to Buchach, and Buchach represents hundreds of towns, as I will say in a moment, across Eastern Europe, they did not come to an empty space where there were only Jews living and then kill them. They came to a town in which there were Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians living together. And the fabric of that society, the relations between these groups, is what determined the nature of the Holocaust there and in hundreds of other towns and cities across Eastern Europe. So Buchach was a town on the eastern, southern borderlands of a great kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, that most people don't remember anymore. In 1772, the first partition of Poland occurred. By the end of the 18th century, Poland had entirely disappeared. It was torn between the three large empires that surrounded it. And Austria created a province called Galicia. And Buchach was on the eastern rim of that eastern province of the Austrian Empire. It had a majority Ukrainian population, a large Polish population, and about 10% of the people living there were Jews. The people who lived in Buchach and many towns like it, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, lived side by side for about 400 years. We know the Jews were living in that town since the 15th century because we have tombstones that have remained there from that period, and in many other towns. They were distinguished from each other by ethnicity, by language, and by religion. The Poles were Roman Catholic, the Ukrainians were Greek Catholic, and the Jews were Jews. They also had different preoccupations. They had different slots, socio-economic slots, but they lived side by side and they did not know any other existence but the existence of different groups living together. Not harmoniously, not in a pluralistic society, not a multicultural society as we would call it today, but a society that functioned most of the time without much violence, and where people knew each other and lived side by side. Now that began changing in the late 19th century, and the change was because of nationalism. And nationalism that raised its head in that area in the last third of the 19th century started defining people not only as who they were, but against the others. And much of it was about who belongs to this place and who does not. The Polish nationalists argued that they had come to Eastern Poland, what is now Western Ukraine, to civilize it. That they were coming to the primitive Ruthenians, as they were called, as we know them now as Ukrainians, to make them into civilized human beings. So theirs was a civilizing mission. The Ukrainian national narrative said that the Ukrainians were the indigenous population and they had been colonized by the Poles, enslaved by them, and served by them, exploited. And that they did that together with their Jewish helpers. That they brought the Jews there to develop those areas and to control the local population. Now Poles and Ukrainians were arguing with each other, who belongs to this place and who does not? Whose place is it? And who should be kicked out? Who should control whom? The Jews in that area did not argue over land. Their story was that they had been invited there by Polish landlords, by magnates, to develop cities and commerce. And that they had also brought culture, particularly Jewish culture, to the towns that they indeed established. When Zionism began emerging there and became eventually the dominant political power among the Jews in Eastern Galicia, it took many of the attributes of Polish and Ukrainian nationalism. That is, it was territorial and it was ethnic. But the territory that he talked about was not the territory of Galicia. The territory that he talked about was the territory of Palestine. And that is another story. Now, life continued in that area, largely without violence, until the outbreak of World War I. And we tend to forget when we speak about the Holocaust, particularly in Eastern Europe, but it would apply also to Western Europe, the immense role that World War I played in preparing the ground for the mass murder of World War II. World War I in that area was disastrously bloody. In the area of this little town itself, tens of thousands of Austrian and Russian and later German soldiers perished. But it was also a war that destroyed one city after another, including the city of Buchach. And it was a war that was waged not only against soldiers, but also against civilians. And much of the violence in that area against civilians was carried out by the Russian army. The Russian army moved and occupied Galicia, first in 1914-15 and then again in 1916-17, and carried out massive violence against Jews. Moreover, I won't keep this photo on, moreover, once the war was over, it did not end. Because once the Austrian Empire collapsed and the Russian Empire collapsed and was taken over by the Soviets, the Poles and Ukrainians started fighting each other in that area and carried a whole series of other atrocities against each other, often murdering entire villages. So that by 1921, when Poland won the war against Ukraine and established Poland again for the first time after the 18th century, that country, as you can see on the map, was made up with very large minorities. The entire eastern part of the country had a majority Ukrainian population. So the nation state of Poland had only 60% ethnic Poles, and 20% of the population concentrated in the east was Ukrainian, and another 10% of the population of Poland were Jews. The Ukrainians never accepted the Polish conquest of that area and kept fighting for autonomy and liberation from Polish rule. And because the Poles would not allow it, the Ukrainians gradually started creating an underground. By 1929, they created an underground known as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, which was fascist. It was influenced by other fascist, East European fascist parties. It was authoritarian. It was anti-Polish and anti-Jewish, and what it wanted to create was what they called a Pole-free and Jew-free independent Ukraine. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Germany, Germany became a major supporter of that organization, which was biding its time and waiting for the moment that it could rise up against the Polish state. Jews in that area, and one can read a beautiful novel called A Guest for a Night by Shmuel Yosef Agnon, Oreach Natal Alun in Hebrew, one of the great novels of the 20th century, which is about Buchach in that area. Jews in Buchach in the 1920s and 30s were a disintegrating community. They never quite recovered from the massive violence of World War I. Many of the young people veered towards Zionism and moved to Palestine, but these were small numbers. By the 1930s, it became increasingly difficult for Jews to leave this area. As you know, there was a Great Depression, and therefore nobody wanted refugees. And in 1936, there was an Arab uprising in Palestine, as a result of which the British greatly limited immigration to Palestine. So Jews were stuck. There was a great growing anti-Semitism among the Ukrainian population. The Polish government, particularly after 1935, became increasingly anti-Jewish. Jews could not find jobs. And in that sense, my grandfather, when he decided in 1935 to move to Palestine, more or less did it in the last moment and was lucky to receive a certificate to Palestine. It became much more difficult a year later. Now, the last important thing that happened in that area before the Germans invaded it was the agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that actually made possible the outbreak of World War II. And that agreement partitioned Eastern Europe between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And this part of Poland, Eastern Poland, was occupied on the 17th of September 1939 by the Soviets. When the Soviets occupied that area, they did what they did best. First, they took a very weak economy, which already suffered from all the impact of the Great Depression, and destroyed it entirely. It nationalized the economy, and therefore people who were poor now were actually lacking food. And the entire area is remembered until, in many testimonies thereafter, as people waiting in bread lines. Secondly, the Soviets turned against their real and imagined enemies. And those enemies were political enemies, whether they were Polish nationalists or Ukrainian nationalists or Jewish Zionists, or against their social enemies, whether they were the Polish nobility or they were Jewish capitalists as they saw them. And therefore, the Soviets enacted several waves of deportation. They deported Poles in large numbers, then they deported Jews, and then they arrested large numbers of Ukrainian political activists, incarcerated them in prison. And just at that point, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. Now the NKVD, which was the Soviet secret police, was told you can either take these political prisoners, most of whom at the time were Ukrainian, with you as you retreat from the advancing German forces, or you can kill them. And they chose the simpler way. They executed thousands, up to 10,000 political prisoners in local jails. And just as the Soviets were retreating, and even before the advanced troops of the Wehrmacht arrived, local populations led by Ukrainian nationalists carried out a vast series of pogroms in that area, arguing that it was the Jews, the Judeo-communists, who had been working together with the Soviets to kill Ukrainian patriots. And this happened throughout this region, and it happened also in the town of Buchach. Ukrainian nationalists also organized military forces and believed that perhaps now, under German rule, they could create an independent Ukraine. The Germans, of course, had no interest whatsoever in creating an independent Ukraine, but local German commanders were very happy to work with Ukrainian militants in order to carry out their own plans. And their main plan in that area, as in many others, was to exterminate the Jewish population. And so they took these militias and transformed them into police forces, into auxiliary police forces. The population in that area initially, the Ukrainian population, was happy to be rid of Soviet rule, just as it had been happy to be rid of Polish rule before. And so people marched and celebrated. The Germans used the anti-Soviet sentiment among Ukrainians and the hopes for an independent Ukraine, and in 1943 created an entire division of Ukrainian volunteers, the Waffen-SS Division Galicia. But what the Germans were most interested in that area was to exterminate the Jews. And in order to carry that out, they did not do what we usually read in the history books. That is, that the Einsatzgruppen, the task forces, moved in and killed vast numbers. They created their outposts of the security police in small towns and charged them with killing the local Jewish population. One of those outposts, Sicherheitspolizei Außenstelle, security police outpost, was established in a town near Buchach called Chotku. There were 20 Germans there, not all of them from Germany. There were also ethnic Germans from Lithuania, from Poland, and from Czechoslovakia. As you can see, they were not there alone. They also brought their wives and mistresses, if they did not have local mistresses, they had an extremely good time because nobody was shooting at them, and they had absolute power over the population. They could do whatever they liked. They had unlimited access to food, unlimited access to alcohol, unlimited access to tobacco. There was a tobacco factory nearby, and complete control over life and death. These 20 Germans killed between the end of the late summer, early fall of 1942 and early June 1943, about 60,000 Jews. Now obviously 20 men, however ruthless, cannot kill 60,000 people on their own. And so in order to kill such large numbers of Jews, they used the auxiliary Ukrainian police. These 20 security police men had about 300 Ukrainian auxiliary policemen next to them. They used local police forces in each town, German, usual ordinary policemen, uniformed policemen, Ukrainian policemen, and Jewish policemen. Jewish policemen who were appointed by the Jewish councils in each town. In Buchach there were about 30 such Jewish policemen. And they would sweep down into each town, round people up, and then either deport them by train to the designated extermination camp, which was Belzec, or after that camp was closed in the end of 1942, they would kill them on the spot. In Galicia as a whole, about 500,000 Jews were murdered, half of them murdered on the spot. In Buchach, about 10,000 Jews were killed. That is more than the population of Buchach, which was the Jewish population of Buchach, which was 8,000 because people were brought from the countryside. And over half of them were killed on the spot. Now it's important to understand that the killing, the mass killing, begins only a year after the Germans arrived there. So during that year, when the Germans are ruling these areas, they are working with the Jews. They have Jewish doctors, they have Jewish dentists, they have Jewish babysitters, they have Jewish cooks. Jews come in and out of German homes throughout that year, and by the time the killing begins, people know each other by name. They have spent this time together to the extent that in some of the killings, people call out to a German they know and say, "How can you shoot me? I was your barber." Of course they know the Ukrainians who are working with them because the Ukrainians are their neighbors. These are people who had lived together with them. As I said, the Jews were also being brought from the countryside into Buchach and then either deported or killed on the spot. It's also important to understand the geography of such killings. We've developed an idea, especially in German historiography, did people know what was happening? If you were living in Berlin, if you were living in Stuttgart, did you know? The Jews were deported to the east, they were sent nach Osten. And there were rumors that bad things were happening, but did people know? Well, in towns like this, there was no question. Because if you look at this aerial photograph, which was taken by the German Luftwaffe in April 1944, you can see the town is in the middle, and the two killing sites are the Jewish cemetery at the upper right-hand side, and the Fedor Hill, which is at the lower part. So that if you're standing in the middle of the town, you can see both sides, and you can certainly hear gun and machine gun fire. If you're standing at one side, you can see the other. Altogether, about 7,000 Jews were killed there, buried in mass graves, and are there until today. Now, once the killing of the Jews, the height of the killing ended, which was in June 1943, when Buchach and in fact all of Galicia were declared Judenfrei, were free of Jews, then the Ukrainian underground started working to have ethnic cleansing of the Polish population so as to ultimately achieve the goal of a Pole-free and Jew-free Ukraine. The same Ukrainian policemen who had worked often with the Germans in rounding up the Jews now deserted these units, joined the Ukrainian underground, and started operations of ethnic cleansing against Poles. And the Poles fought back because the Polish Home Army was also active in that area. And so we had a second wave of massive killings between Poles and Ukrainians that often meant a great deal of killing, decimation of entire villages. Now what Ukrainians living in that area remember most is what happened at the end. When the Soviets came, the Ukrainian insurgency tried to fight the Soviets because Ukrainians did not see this as liberation but as reoccupation. The Soviets again did what they did best. They used their NKVD units and ruthlessly suppressed this insurgency, not only by fighting the insurgents themselves, but by deporting large numbers of Ukrainians, entire villages, to Central Asia and to gulags. What people in the region did not want to remember, and are reluctant to remember even today, are individuals such as Volodymyr Kaznovsky, who was an attorney in the region before the war, and during the war became the chief of police in Buchach, and consequently had a great deal of blood on his hands. He was eventually caught by the Soviets in the 50s and sent to a gulag. Now, as I said, there were about 8,000 Jews in Buchach in 1939. In March 1944, the city was liberated for the first time. But 2 weeks later, the Red Army made a tactical retreat in that area. For the Red Army, it was simply a tactical retreat. For the 800 Jews who came out of hiding, this was the end, because they were in no position to run after the Soviet troops. They had been in hiding, they were sick. And so by the time the Red Army returned the second time, in July 1944, only 60 Jews were left in that area. And these are the 60 Jews who put up a memorial on that killing site on the Federal Hill. The memorial itself was shortly thereafter removed, probably by the Soviets, because the Soviets did not promote Jewish specific commemoration. They preferred to talk about innocent Soviet civilians who were killed by the fascists. There was one small memorial on the killing site. It's a memorial for just one case of the first case of mass killing of 450 Jews. It lay broken on the forest floor for most of the Soviet period, and more recently was put up again. But it's almost impossible to find in the forest without a guide. On the other hand, there is now a very prominent memorial on the site where thousands of Jews were murdered, but it is a memorial for the Ukrainian liberation fighters and martyrs of Ukrainian independence. There is also a memorial on another hill overlooking the city of Stepan Bandera, who was the commander or the chief of the more radical faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and is now glorified, especially in Western Ukraine. The Jewish cemetery, which is also the second site of mass killing, was for many decades abandoned, used as a garbage dump, and only last year, for the first time, thanks to money that was donated from the outside, was it surrounded by a wall. And as you see, if you're standing on the Jewish cemetery, the hill on the other side is the second killing site, and the city is in the middle between the two. Another memorial that was put up there has since been damaged, and if you come there in the summer, you cannot approach it because it's covered with thorns. There was one prominent Jewish building in the town that Agnon wrote about a great deal, the Große Schild, the great synagogue. That edifice was heavily damaged in the fighting in spring-summer 1944, but was not destroyed. When the Soviets came, they brought a demolition team. They decided that since there are no Jews there, they might as well demolish it. It took them 5 years to demolish it, and they used the stones to create a cinema, a Kinotheater, a beautiful Soviet structure, as you can see. The last remaining building, which was the Bet HaMidrash that Agnon wrote about, the study house that you find mentioned in many of his stories, stood there until 2001. But in 2001, the mayor decided to build a shopping center and demolished it too. So if you come to Buchach today, and last time I was there was in 2016, over the remnants of the medieval Polish castle, you will see a flag. The flag waving there is the flag of the UPA. It's the flag of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was the armed section of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. It itself has not existed for decades, but it is a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism, which of course is now particularly prominent because of the fighting in eastern Ukraine. So to conclude, I want to mention a few points that I think may be of interest to you here today. The first question that I had, as I said, was about the encounter between the perpetrators and the victims, the notion that we had of genocide as being industrial. Well, in those local genocides, hundreds of them, this genocidal encounter between perpetrators and victims on the local level was intimate and public. It was not detached and it was not secret. Everybody knew, everybody could see, everybody could hear, and the perpetrators and the victims knew each other, often by name. On the local level, the category that we have grown used to make use of, that of bystanders, and we usually would rather think of ourselves as bystanders. We don't want to be victims and we cannot imagine ourselves being perpetrators. On the local level, that category is meaningless. No one was a bystander. Everyone was engaged on one level or another. It only had to do with degrees of engagement. There were some who resisted. There were some who totally collaborated. Most people were somewhere in between. At one point they collaborated, at another point they might have helped some people, at other points they held their heads low, and most of the time, because these were poor areas, what they were concerned with most was property. And if someone living next to you, friends of yours, living in an apartment upstairs, were taken out to the street and shot, you felt sorry for them because you knew them and you knew their children, they played with your children. But now that they'd been shot, you were likely to move into their apartment because it was a better apartment, they had better pots and pans, they had nice blankets, and once you did that, you became part of this genocidal process. People were not just looking. Thirdly, while I would say that one can identify absolute evil in such cases, there were perpetrators there who were men who had no mercy whatsoever and never felt remorse, even decades later. Goodness was often ambivalent, because the same people who would give shelter, whether because they felt sorry for someone or because they were offered money, often were those who denounced, because those who denounced had to know where people were hiding. And they might denounce because the people they were hiding ran out of money and they couldn't afford to buy them milk or bread. They might have denounced because they were afraid that their neighbors saw that they were hiding Jews and thought that they were making a fortune from it and would denounce them. And so they said, we'll do it first. And they might have denounced because these people they were hiding had something that they really wanted and they got impatient. They had a nice fur coat, they had good boots, and so they asked them. At the same time, there were people who were involved in the killing, including one individual whose name we don't know, who was a German officer in an area nearby in a town called Tustedt, who protected Jews in the last phases of the fighting there. When the Gestapo, the security police were all gone because it was getting dangerous, they didn't want to stay there. The German army was disintegrating, the Red Army was coming in, and remaining Jews were hiding in the forest. A rumor went around that there is one German officer in Tustedt who decided to help the Jews, not against the Gestapo, not against the security police, but against local hoodlums, peasants, bandits who were massacring Jews. And hundreds of Jews started moving through the forest into this town. 600 Jews ended up there in Tustedt and were protected by this officer. And we know about this because of their testimonies, not from him. And he protected them until the morning of the day in which the Red Army came. Once he left and the Red Army came in, the Luftwaffe came and bombed this town. And a couple of hundred of those people who had survived the war until the very end were killed in that bombing. But it was thanks to him that we know about this case, because that meant that hundreds of Jews survived and could tell that story. Two other last points that I want to make. First, that when we view the Holocaust through this perspective, we get a very different picture of what the Holocaust was about. In fact, we see that in hundreds of towns, about half of the victims of the Holocaust died in these inter-ethnic communities. The killings there, the relations there, were much more similar to what happened in such genocides as in Bosnia and Rwanda than our image of industrial killing in Auschwitz. And so while the killing installations created by the Nazis were unprecedented and have remained unprecedented, thank God, much of the killing was very much like many other genocides. And the last thing I would say, especially today, and what we heard today should make us think more about that. When you observe a community such as Buchach, in which people lived side by side for centuries, and had perfected the way of living together, you realize that at some point, that thin veneer, that thin crust of what we believe in as civilization, as order, as social order, can break. You realize that the police that you may call up because you see that there's some violence happening on the street may come and arrest you. You realize that once the law, which has remained the same, is turned against you, then your neighbor can walk into your house with an axe and kill your family. And so this dynamic that you can see in every town throughout the Holocaust, that we see again the danger of that rising again, this is what we should watch out for. And remember that the early warning signs are when people start talking about others as those who do not belong to the solidarity of humanity, who are people who are other, whether they are called vermin or whether they're called cockroaches or whatever you call them. Once regimes and groups start speaking of other populations in those terms, we know these are the early signs of genocide, and we have to stop them as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Omer Bartov, for your very thought-provoking and really very important presentation. Honored guests, we invite you to come again to the Holocaust and Genocide Center, explore our permanent exhibition. Don't forget to explore the many temporary exhibitions that we have at the moment, and you see it on the left and on the right. We are hosting the exhibition The Girl in the Diary, Searching for Rivka from the Łódź Ghetto. And this was done in partnership with the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, Western Galicia, and with the Embassy of Poland here in Pretoria. Excellent exhibition that will be with us for the next month. We would also like to invite you to join us for the many events that we hold. Every week we hold at least one event here, and you are all very welcome. And finally, I would like to sincerely thank our Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center team of hard-working staff, members and volunteers. They are all here with us tonight. Of course, the United Nations Information Center,